Welcome to another episode of Foolproof Theology. Today on the show, we've got a great guest. His name is Michael Foster, and I'm really excited to dive into the topics of church planting and masculinity with him. Before we get on the air, I wanted to let you know about a great opportunity that's coming up this summer, the Worldview Youth Academy, hosted by the Ezra Institute. This is a great way to empower your child to be the cultural leader they were designed to be. If you're a Christian parent, which most of you are listening, this is a really great opportunity for them to be equipped with a strong Christian foundation, to be cultural leaders, to shape a bright future for the world. And so I would encourage you to head over to EzraInstitute.com. You can find the Worldview Leadership Academy over there. Register now. If you register now before the end of January, you're going to get $50 off your enrollment. So register today, EzraInstitute.com, and you'll have a great opportunity here to equip your child with a Christian worldview to really shape the world to come. So sign up over there and enjoy this episode. Welcome to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's great to be with you here today. We've got Michael Foster on the show. Michael Foster is a pastor out in Batavia, Ohio, and I'm really glad to have him on the show today. We tried this a year ago. I think it was a year ago, and it didn't work. Internet connections were funky, and so I'm glad that we were able to resolve that and finally get you back on the show, Michael. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
So I put out on the Twitters, the X, what should we talk about on air? And we got some funny comments. We got, how does Southeastern Indiana produce such talent? We've got Michael Foster, Matt Patrick, Aaron Wren, Woody Harrelson. Any other major figures from Southeastern Indiana, Michael?
Not from Southeastern. William Bailey is from Lafayette, who's also known as Axl Rose.
Nice.
And then Michael Jackson is from Gary, Indiana. Yeah. Also, I think the lead singer of Blind Melon was from Indiana, but I could be wrong on that. But I know Axl Rose was. So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Powerful state.
Powerful state. We've also got church planting. We're actually going to talk about that. Some people were asking about like the Moscow mood, evangelism, but that's kind of out of both of our purviews, considering we're not in Moscow, Idaho. One of my friends put, why is Acts 29 gay? That may come up in when we talk about church planting. Zen versus rogue. Are you a Zen or rogue guy, Michael?
I'm allergic to tobacco, so I never really got into any of that stuff. So now that's chewing tobacco, right? Is that what that is?
It's nicotine. Yeah, it's just nicotine, no tobacco. So,
yeah, I don't do that. Yeah,
I don't do that. Another church plan, we've got Paedo Communion membership. That came up a couple times. I'm going to be real straight. I have a lot of disinterest in talking about Paedo Communion. I know there's a lot of guys who are talking about, especially with your, relationship with the CRAC. I'm kind of, it's kind of like talking about Paedo baptism. I'm a Baptist and you're a Paedo Baptist. And I'm kind of like, it is what it is. But you're a Westminster guy, right?
I am. So no, we don't do Paedo Communion in our church, but we have a lot of great brothers who do believe that, who we love.
Yeah, for sure. We've also got some questions about manhood. We'll talk about manhood. We'll talk about wrestling, maybe. That may come up in manhood. We've got counting cards. Just for my audience, I've heard this story, but I'd love to share it with them. You counted cards and made a living doing that. Is that correct?
Was part of a card counting team that was pretty huge in the late 2000s, mid to late, called the Church Team. It was ran by Colin Jones and Ben Crawford, and they made a movie about it. So it was a documentary called Holy Rollers, and did an episode of This American Life on it, ESPN, New York Times, that sort of stuff years ago. So yeah, I was on that team, and probably one of the best financed card counting teams of all time. And a lot of the people on the team were Christians or professing Christians. It was wild, man. So yeah, I've been kicked out of a lot of casinos. Actually, in this room somewhere, I have a dollar chip from every casino I've ever played. I believe that's 184 casinos. And I've certainly won and lost, millions of dollars over that time. And yeah, it was a really mixed bag. I've been meaning to write a book called The Gospel According to Blackjack, and the ups and downs of that experience. The stories are insane. So I just need to sit down and record them so I don't forget them. but but actually hung out with the guy that got me into it. He came over to my office, and we talked about the old days where we were being chased out of casinos and being hanging out with celebrities and all that nonsense. So
That's crazy, man. Did you kind of cut your teeth at the riverboat there in Lawrenceburg, Indiana? Is that where you started out?
I cut my teeth really out at yeah, I did do some trading there, but I did a lot in Seattle because they have these things called minis. They're little tiny casinos, and they're like one was called Kenmore Lanes. It was in the back of a bowling alley, and there they have like $1 minimums, and that way when you're training, you can use real money but not lose a whole lot. Because usually a minimum at most casinos is $5 to $10. Usually $10. Some are even 25. So certainly the ones out there in Vegas are. So I did a lot of playing out there in Seattle before I got approved and brought onto the team. But yeah, man, that was Argosy Casino. Then it got renamed. It's like Hollywood or something now, and that's in my hometown. And I got kicked out of Argosy for preaching the gospel when I was 17. Me and a friend snuck in to preach the gospel to people, and we got kicked out. And then years later, I got kicked out for being a card counter. So that's pretty hilarious. Anyway,
That is insane, man. And I'm remembering some puzzle pieces here because Matt is from Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Are
yep.
you older? Are you a few years older than Matt? Is that right?
Yeah, Matt was in the same. Went to middle school with my brother Wayne, and I have vague recollections of Matt, I think from the football team, because my brother played on the football team. But it was Wayne who told me, he's like, hey, you know, Matt Patrick became a pastor. And I was like, Matt who? And then he reminded me who he was. And so then once Emily and I were out visiting Colorado, and man, I don't know if we had kids yet or not. We did have a kid or two, and we went to your guys' church and I remember the worship being gay. Uh, that's what I remember. And I remember liking Matt. And I remember thinking, this is a good dude, but these are kind of Acts 29 guys, and it was what I had come to expect at that time. So
Yeah,
that when did you guys plant your church?
2011.
So this was like not long after that. And as I recall, you guys were like in a gym or something, or you're
We're in
at a
a
school.
middle school. Yeah.
Yeah, that's when I came there. So
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, that actually gets us perfectly aligned to talk about church planting. You have background in the Acts 29 network. Were you a planter with Acts 29? What's the story there?
yeah, so I got saved in a charismatic church. I was there about a year, read First Corinthians and said, uh-oh, and went to a Calvary Chapel church with a friend. Calvary Chapel, started out on the West Coast and had a real big emphasis on church planting. And so I really fell in love with the idea of church planting through the Calvary Chapel influence. At the same time, I was reading like Augustine and the Church Fathers, and I Calvary Chapel is big on verse by verse teaching. They recommended a book um, by John Stott on preaching, and another book by MacArthur, Rediscovering Expository Preaching. And in that book, there was a chapter on all these great expositors, and all of them were Reformed and Calvinists. I mean, almost all of them. So I bought a bunch of those books, including like Martin Lloyd-Jones, and all these guys love Calvin's teaching. So I started reading Calvin. So I slowly became a Reformed and a Calvinist that way. And I never went through a cage stage because I think there's something about just reading books and coming to conclusions slowly that keep you from going through that cocky cage stage. That's one of the dangers of the internet right now, is that people get knowledge so cheaply, right? And they're so certain. They've listened to like half a podcast, but even if they've listened to like 5 or 6 podcast episodes or read Wikipedia, it's crazy how cocky they are and how sure they are. Those are the same people you see like 5 years later switch their views. But I had become Reformed, and I was trying to work it out with Calvary Chapel, but man, Calvary Chapel was kind of on a Calvinist witch hunt at the time. And there was a guy named George Bryson that wrote a book called The Darker Side of Calvinism, and it was terrible. And then Dave Hunt wrote a book called What Love Is This. I read that book. That was the book that convinced me to be a Calvinist. It was a book against Calvinism. It was so poorly argued. I was like, okay, I'm done. This is what I am. So we tried to work it out with our church, but it didn't. So I went down to Covenant First Presbyterian Church, which was a pretty conservative PCUSA church in downtown Cincinnati. And while I was there, my friend, my card counting friend actually, had just got back from Seattle. And I was telling him what I was looking for. I was like, man, these churches are so effeminate and weak. I've been using the word effeminate for a long time. And they don't do evangelism and they don't reach men. And I just want something that's reformed. He was like, dude, I just met this guy, Mark. You gotta hear this dude. So he had just gotten back. This is like early 2004, maybe late 2003. And he had just met Mark Driscoll. And so he actually, I think, was at an Acts 29 boot camp, a very early one. And he handed me the binder from that boot camp, which is in this room somewhere. And that was back where the guy from Terra Nova up in New York was still in
Yeah,
it, Ed
yeah,
something.
yeah.
And so I read it and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. So I started the process. They had just brought Steve Thomas, as the guy that kind of processed you. I think Adam Sinnott was doing some stuff as well. And then I flew out to David Fairchild was my assessor. Barry Kelly was my assessor. Rick White, who we both still know, was my assessor. And then that was at Matt Chandler's church in 2005, I guess it was. We got approved to come in. And so, yeah, that's how we came in Acts 9. I planted a church in downtown Cincinnati called Seven Hills Church. We grew to about 35, 40 adults in about 2.5 years. And I was real inexperienced. I was like in my early 20s. And I was card counting during all this. It's a whole nother story. But I also became more traditionally reformed. So it wasn't just my soteriology. Really, my view of the sacraments and the nature of the church started to change. I've been thinking about this past week about how much of what drives me is ecclesiology, where these days people talk a lot about eschatology. But I think I'm more driven by ecclesiological convictions than I am almost anything. And that was really happening back then because I was just reading lots and lots of Reformed systematics and started reading The Church of Christ by Bannerman and things like that. And I was changing. So I ended up deciding to leave that church plant. And we kind of moved some of those people into Michael Clary's church, which Michael had just started up. His church had some stupid name. Center City Church, right? It was such a dumb name. And now it's got a great name, Christ the King Church. But I think he was just transitioning to Christ the King as a name. And a lot of our people went there and the rest of them went to a PCA church plant that just had come in. And then I took 5 years off from the ministry. Went to a small pastor's college that's now defunct and took a job as a director down in Greenville, director at a PCA church just outside of Greenville, South Carolina, Spartanburg. And they wanted me to go back to seminary and get ordained in the PCA. So I went to Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, graduated, went through the licensure and ordination process, and then got installed as an associate pastor. In the PCA, was involved in a lot of that revoice kind of fight, and really taking on covenant. I learned a whole lot about ecclesiology. I learned a whole lot about the good old boys, for better, for worse. And then at the end of that, I was like pretty burned out on vocational ministry. I don't like it. I don't like being full time. I don't think most pastors work 40 hours in a week, and some are going to be offended by that. I just don't think it's true. I think guys that tell me they spend 20 hours in their sermon, I think, how dumb do you have to be that inefficient? 20 hours. Maybe if you're a new minister, that makes sense to me. But like, I don't know. Like, why not 18? Why not 15? Like that last 5 hours, what are you writing? Are you writing a peer-reviewed paper or whatever? So I just don't think those guys are doing that. There are some guys that really are working a full-time job, but I wanted a little more flexibility in my life to pursue entrepreneurial stuff. And I don't like to be entrepreneurial at the church. I don't like to innovate, but I am an entrepreneur at heart. And so I was looking, we knew we wanted to move back home to Cincinnati. This is where my wife is from, and southern Indiana is right across the river from Ohio. So we moved back here with an eye towards church planning, but I decided I was going to take a full year off ministry to kind of count the cost before I did it again. And then we planted East River Church.
Excellent. So there's a lot to unpack there, and we could go a lot of different directions. We could spend a few hours probably talking about it, but I want to get on some particular issues. So coming out of the Acts 29, movement, Young Restless Reformed is the kind of broader concept, Neo-Calvinism even broader. You visit our church plant, obviously it feels effeminate to you. What do you think, drives Acts 29? You talk about eschatology, ecclesiology. What would you say is driving kind of a central doctrine or central feature of kind of the Acts 29 movement?
Yeah, it's real easy. It's cool. So the driving thing of Acts 29 was to be cool. And that's why Acts 29 hasn't changed. Acts 29 was trying to be cool back in the day, and it was really appealing to men. I remember Driscoll always talking about watching MMA and comparing Jesus to MMA fighter, and drinking beer and smoking cigars. And I remember once there was this terrible post about how Driscoll is under investigation for doping, and that's why his sermons are so amazing.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, I remember all that. And it was all about, if you think about their music too, the music that was coming out of X, very moody, sort of Seattle grunge-ish stuff. And then there was that I wasn't really listening to much Christian music at that time because it's so terrible. But they had that sort of thrice feel, which was not as grungy. I don't know what that style of music's called, but they were always trying to be cool and appeal to a younger crowd. And I think as it switched from Driscoll to Chandler to whoever's over it now. It's that one guy. I'm trying to think of Brian. Is it Brian Howard? Is that who's
Yeah.
over it? Yeah.
Yeah.
It switched to Brian Howard. Um, it kind of, what was cool a few years ago was, loving everybody, and that love is defined as CRT, critical race theory,
Yeah.
or being woke, or socialism, or whatever. So I think Acts 29 hasn't changed in any major way. I think the main ethic of being cool is there. There was a lot of great things in Acts 29. The desire to be accessible and to reach people is good. Uh, but that got redefined as being attractive to people, meeting the people where they're at by telling them what they want to hear, as opposed to being accessible, using language that they would understand to make the doctrine of Scripture all the more clear, which should make the doctrine even more attractive if the Holy Spirit's working in them, or even more offensive if their heart's being hardened, right? And so that's how I saw it. I left Acts 29 before I quit the church plant in 2008, I think it was. And I did it because I remember I was this is before they launched the city. It was like this online forum. And Driscoll was starting to have all his weird charismatic talk. And then he seemed really angry to me. He just always seemed like an angry dude. And then I remember there was this post in that forum on like how to have a kick-ass worship service. And I just thought, this isn't what I'm about. I don't care. Like my ministry was being bogged down with people trying to figure out how to be parents and working through marriage issues, pastoral things, and the whole let's be cool. I just thought this wasn't for me. And I also thought that Driscoll, I remember saying to someone that he was a ticking time bomb and that he was going to blow up. And I was like, yeah, that guy's angry. He's going to like have a stroke or blow up one day. And I said he was a powder keg. That's what I said.
Yeah.
And I had no clue how it would go down. So we left, and I still have, there still are good churches in Acts 29, not as many as there once was. And I did learn things from it, but I'm glad I got out when I did. I got out pretty early.
Sure. So with Acts 29, this desire to be cool, I can sense that. I mean, like when I got into the network, I can perceive that's what a lot of it was about. I mean, trying to be attractive, but it was they tried to mitigate the worst of that. I don't think it was done to great success because there wasn't a lot of theological connection in terms of our pragmatics and evaluating it's just a pragmatic network, and it's just a kind of a different brand of ARC or these other church planting networks that are much
Yeah.
more seeker sensitive and
Yep.
they're just a different brand of seeker sensitive. Um, so with church planting particularly, if somebody's hearing this and Michael Foster's going to come to their church and like, well, the worship's kind of gay, it's kind of effeminate, and they go, well, I don't want to be that. Michael, what do I need to do different? What would you encourage a church planter if they're going, man, I see what you're seeing. I don't want to be about cool. I don't want to be about that. How would you encourage them to change? What would you say needs to change and be the emphasis instead of that?
Well, yeah. So what I think is this, make it about reaching the people in your community in the forms that they would understand. If I'm not one of these high church guys at all, I do prefer hymnals and something real simple like a guitar or a piano. That's what I personally prefer. That's actually not what happens at East River most Sundays, though. Most Sundays it's a full band up there, and so what I would say is find a form that fits your people, and then ask, like, can guys participate? A lot of times guys don't like to hold a note for a real long time. Most guys don't. And so any music that's going really high pitch, holding long notes, that's not, those guys aren't going to participate. So here's one way to think about it. Will a 10-year-old boy sing this? Can I get a 10-year-old boy to sing this? So start asking that about like music forms and all that, because the goal is to get people involved. And then really when you have a bunch of men and women singing together, it's kind of impossible for it to be too effeminate. Right. It's
Right.
just because what makes it effeminate is the sound, and also just listen to the lyrics. Are the lyrics about how awesome you are and how you do everything awesome for God? And is it narcissistic, and or does it like recast Jesus kind of like purely in a lover sort of terms? Or are we talking about, Christ our Lord, Christ our Redeemer, Christ our warrior king, so just in terms of music, that's what I would say. Will 10-year-old boys sing it? Can you get masculine men to sing it? No one likes to sing something they can't sing.
Right.
I love karaoke, but there's certain songs where it's like, I can't hit that note. I'm not going to try that. That's crazy. Let's stick to things that I can actually sing and not hurt people's ears too much.
Sure.
Um, the other thing is, when in your preaching, is just to preach what's before you, preach the text, preach it hard, let the chips fall where it may to a certain degree. Like guys like risk preaching that takes risks. Men like this really hard for guys love coaches that are hard on them. Like my son is wrestling, and he's at a wrestling match right now, and his coach is so hard on him. But guys respond to that. Guys respond to being challenged, and that's why pastors can get away with beating up on dudes every Sunday, but not women. Because guys are like, yeah, I want to be awesome, I want to grow, like, and I know I'm failing and whatever. But at some point, you know, you have to also encourage them. How can you call a guy to be courageous without encouragement, right? So those are a few ways I would just say is like, you don't have to change a whole lot, but speak to the issues that men are like dealing with, whether it's job, vocation, managing responsibility, time management, delegation, teaching their children, leading their wife, especially leading their wife when she's not being super cooperative, those sort of things.
Yeah, and I think going into kind of the way the system operates, it seems to me that there was a lot of that. Like they were trying to emphasize reaching men.
Yep.
But what's interesting about what you're bringing to the table is it's much more simple. And your critique of Driscoll is actually different than like what you're going to hear on like Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, where it's coming from a very secular perspective on misogyny and these kind of words. You're just addressing it from an ecclesial perspective, what a pastor does. And in the network and in a lot of church planting, you see church planter as entrepreneur. Can you start something new? Can you grow it? And
Yeah.
that's like held as the preeminent thing. And that's what's been, I think, over the last 4 years, particularly for me and our church, it's like, man, like that's exhausting. Like it's just you're constantly trying to like figure out, you're trying to find the pulse of culture and match it with something. And I'm like, no, like people have been doing this for thousands of years. And God's word, I'm not a regulative principle guy, but they've got some good stuff in there. Like that, there's some good wisdom to be learned from the saints who came before us. And so I think pastor as entrepreneur can be really a huge problem in church planting, because most church planters aren't even cognizant that that's what's happening. They sense kind of this desire to start something new, and that could be a church, that could be a business, whatever. And then somebody comes and says, you have a gifting, you should plant a church, and like, oh, cool, I can start something new for God. And they get into
Mm-hmm.
ministry, and then they realize they're exhausted. They're always trying to innovate. They're always trying to like speak to CRT, or like something happens in culture. And so it's just a game, and a marketing game. And that's what frustrated me, is like, I didn't know that was happening. I think I was kind of like, maybe that's my own immaturity or whatever you want to say it is. But once I began to see that, I was like, dude, let's just go back to tradition as much as we can. Let's adopt a confession. Let's adopt practices that are more in line with the tradition. So that way we're not constantly pivoting and feeling this pressure to release statements or speak on this matter, or,
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff. Do you think that kind of speaks to the issue as well?
Absolutely. So I think there is a lot the Reformed world could learn from the early Acts 29 network. Namely, a church is an institution and an organization, and it does require institutional organizational leadership. It does, right? It has a form, it has budgets, it has a way to make decisions. There's when you're making big budgetary decisions, there's a wise way to bring that across, and there's managing meetings, elections, all that sort of stuff is part of a church, and that is tradition too. It's been that way for a long time. So there's a lot that they could learn from that. Also, I do think that all church planners should be pastors, but not all pastors are church planners. Do you think, generally speaking, uh, the church planting pastor is a guy that has real clear vision, that's good at communicating it? So vision is a mental picture of a task completed, right? So you have this idea of what this church should be in so many years. So for me, it has to do with how many officers that we have, and where I want our liturgy to be, and our discipleship, and all that sort of stuff. So he's good at that vision and good at communicating that, and also has, if you think of like Edwin Friedman, he's got real good, he's good at failure at nerve, right? He doesn't freak out. For me, like when you're starting a church plant, there's all sorts of things that aren't being done, and I always tell people, you can't drop balls you don't pick up, right? Well, that ball's being dropped. No, it's not. It's on the ground. And well, but I picked it up, and now I'm stressed out. Like, well, you probably shouldn't have done that, right? Well, will you take it now? No, I will not take it now. If you had left it on the ground, then someone who had time to do it would have picked it up, and then they would be in charge of it, and you and I would be having these conversations. Um, and so I think a church planner is a sort of person that has uh, a good vision, good ability to communicate the vision, and the ability to stay on mission and not go outside of his bandwidth too much. Guys that are heavily pastoral, but without that sort of experience, they'll start a church, and churches tend to, the last couple of years have been exceptional, but churches tend to draw in very needy people and malcontents, right? And that's just because who's in the market? Who's in the market for
Right.
a church, right?
Yeah.
And the other people might be, folks who have just relocated or have gone through some sort of theological transition. But a heavy amount of them are needy people and malcontents. And what you have to realize as a church planner is like, I can't, if I give those people too much time, then I'll never get the steady people that will allow me to minister to people like that down the road. And so church planner has this sort of ruthless commitment to the mission of getting it done, and understands that those needy people are black holes. It's like digging in the sand. Like the sand just fills it right back up. They're like in a constant state of need, and you can throw good time after bad with them all you want. But as you spend all that time on those people, you are ignoring the good soil. And so church planners know that the guy that's got good ROI, that's the guy you spend even more time on. They're like a stock, right? When a stock has a good yield, you buy more of that stock, right? So you put more, and then those guys even flourish all the more. And then you start to develop this strong backbone, the strong core of a church, and you can minister to those other people because you gain stability. So I think Driscoll and some of those guys from those boot camps and talks, they used to cover some of that stuff pretty well. But they take like Driscoll's rejection of eternal generation of the Son, right? That's heresy, man. That's a very clear teaching, and his fake little systematic theology. He rejects eternal generation of the Son, which is bonkers. And Driscoll's lack of education shows there. His lack of respect of confessions and traditional theology shows there. The fact that guys are almost always recreating the wheel with their views on communion or whatever, when there's this like incredible resource of historical Christianity that they could be pulling from that would root the church in something that God's been doing for a long time. So think about it, Acts 29, right? So it's the continuing work of Acts. It's the future work. It's pretty ironic for a group to be all about the future, to not see the importance of being rooted in the past. And I think being rooted in historical Christianity, what it does with people is they realize that this isn't just about Mark Driscoll or Pastor Jim or this celebrity or that celebrity. This is about belonging to the church historical, and that helps protect them from the siren call of Eastern Orthodoxy, the siren call of Roman Catholicism, because I think people are attracted to that because you're like, oh wow, look at all these church fathers, you know. And if you're really Reformed, like you've been reading Calvin, Calvin loves Cyprian, he loves Augustine, he quotes those guys a lot. And if you're deep in that stuff, people feel a connection. Cyprian's like 250, right? Augustine's the third, late third century, and these guys weren't taking advantage of that. So if we could bring those two worlds together, right, this sort of high value on institutional leadership, organization, the best parts of entrepreneurship that can like more of your mindset, and bring that together with we're trying to establish historic biblical Christianity. I think that's a powerful movement, and I see the beginnings of that starting to happen right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think I see that as well. And that's that you're speaking on, you're helping me articulate things that we sense at our church, the things that are driving us at this point. Because yeah, it's just, it becomes this hamster wheel where yeah, you just don't know what's happening. You're constantly trying to pivot. You're investing in people. We call them sinkhole relationships, which if you're a person listening and you're going, that seems really harsh. We shouldn't talk about people that way. Get into a little bit of ministry in the local church, and you'll understand what we're talking about. You'll have some experience. This is simply the way Jesus led and ministered. He invested in particular people with different resources, and so I think there's a lot of wisdom Michael's offering here with church planning for the future. Guys see an opportunity today maybe to plant the kind of church you're talking about. What do you think? I mean, is church planning still a viable model? Is it necessary? And what do you think needs to happen to see kind of a new movement? Maybe we don't need a new movement. Maybe we need just really traditional movements. But how do you see church planning going from here on out?
Man, early 2000 Tim Keller's manual on church planning is good. I have it around here somewhere. I bought it. It was a little ringed binder. It was blue, and I got it from Redeemer in like 2001 or 2002. And there's a lot of really good stuff in there. It's just sad that he kind of redefined contextualization to, as opposed to removing the distractions from the sword of Scripture, it was about blunting its blade, is what it turned into. But I remember reading that, and I thought, man, this is really, really good stuff. And there's a lot of stuff out there already. But guys like Tim Keller, like we saw the fruit of their ministry that went a really bad direction, and everyone's given to like all or nothing attitudes these days. It's like, either Tim Keller is terrible and you can't use all his stuff, or he's great and he's awesome. And how dare you speak evil against the Protestant
Right.
Pope? It's like so crazy. I'm like, well, no, that stuff is really helpful. So I think he turned that into a book. I don't know. I haven't read any Keller's books, but that was a really helpful one. And I think that model's good, where you need to understand your host community. You need to love it. And you are bringing the teaching of Scripture to bear on that community to develop and make disciples. And so my proof for this is real simple: is Colossae is not Corinth, Corinth is not Colossae, but both of them are having the word of God applied to them by their teachers. But in Colossae, they've got this kind of weird podunk teaching. So a mixture of angels and proto-Gnosticism and all this stuff. And so they're going to deal with that. And they're going to speak to those issues there. And then you have in Corinth, them dealing with, spiritual gifts and all the chaos going on there. So they're bringing the word to bear on the needs of that community. And that's part of church planting. It's a missional work. It's missionary work, starting that. So I think that's great, bringing that to your community in a way that's accessible to them, helping them understand the importance of the word through exegetical preaching and sacraments. That's the real work of the ministry. So setting that stuff up. The problem I have with a lot of church planting movements is that they're more of a franchise, which is, so there's two types I don't like. There's boutique churches and there's franchise churches. So a franchise church is some dude goes to Moscow or goes to Peter Lightheart's church or went to an Acts 29 church and he says, this is awesome. This is what we need in my town that's totally different from that town, right?
Yeah.
And you, like, take Moscow. Moscow's a great example of Christ Church. Christ Church has a 50-year history. It's in a small college town that is, kind of towards the northwest, and people are going to try to bring that final form out to Indiana or out to Alabama or whatever. It's like has a whole nother history. They didn't get to where they were overnight. It took a long time, and so they think they can just take this franchise and plop it down. And it's always kind of like weird. It's like that hilarious meme where where it's like the mom telling the son, I have that thing you want at home. And the thing you
Yeah.
want at home is like some sort of cruddy version of it. It's like,
Right.
and that's like, oh, we have Christ Church at home. And then it's like, yeah, it's totally terrible. And I've been to churches where people are trying to do high church liturgy and they're clearly new to it. And it's awkward and painful. And the music is terrible. And the chanting is extra bad and all that stuff. And you're like, man, I think you should start a little smaller and slower. So that's that franchise model that doesn't usually work, especially if it's a really specific version. And then there's the boutique model, which is it's kind of a church that focuses on what I would call derivative doctrines. So if you think about it in terms of, if you think about doctrine like dominoes, you have dominoes you hit that hit other dominoes that hit other dominoes. And so they're consequences of other doctrines. So if I believe this, eventually you'll believe that. So these are churches that believe in derivative doctrines that are certainly down the line of the dominoes, and they don't establish those early dominoes. And they're all about maybe like postmillennialism, right? So postmillennialism, despite what everyone says, it is not the driving thing that people think it is. It's kind of nuts. Like, how blind do you have to be to not see this? First off, the vast majority of the church hasn't been postmillennial. I am postmillennial. I don't have a problem with it. But the vast majority of the church has not been postmillennial. The vast majority of people who have done awesome things were not postmillennial. The vast majority of churches that stayed open during COVID weren't postmillennial. What they were is that they believed in the necessity of gathered worship, right? That's ecclesiological conviction. And that's why you got like guys who are premillennial, like MacArthur, staying open, and or a lot of the Calvary chapels actually stayed open. And then you have the crazy charismatics that stayed open too. And they're like, no, we got to get together and dance and, do our Shandai Rokos and all that sort of stuff. But when you look at that doctrine, there's a reason it is not as explicitly stated in most confessions. And it's because it's down the line. Now, does it have major consequences? Does it matter and all that stuff? I think it does. But I think when you plant a church, you have to understand there's a lot of steps to get to that. And people start with post. I can't tell you how many emails I've got. Are you postmillennial? Are you theonomic? Are you reconstructionist? We're thinking about relocating, to ride out the coming storm. And I'm
Sure.
like, brother, I got the storm that's coming is like storms on Jupiter. Storms on Jupiter last like a century or something. Everyone was waiting for America to fall into Mad Max world, all post-apocalyptic, and what they're about to find out, it's like a turtleneck culture. You ever had a turtleneck? Turtleneck feels like a weak man trying to choke you, right? So we're going to feel choked for years by bureaucracy. This stuff is, I don't think it's going to collapse overnight. I think this is going to go on for a decade, perhaps even longer. I might be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I'm glad I've got guns and I've got friends.
Sure.
But I think it's going to take a long time. And so I got these people that want to come, and so what is Reconstruction? What do you mean by that? Do you know that all the Reconstructionists fought amongst each other? Many of them ended their life alienated and outside of churches and got kicked out of lots of denominations because they're cannibals, right? Cannibals eat their own. Do you know that? Like, what do you mean? Do you mean Greg Bonson? Okay, cool, awesome. I like that dude. Or do you mean this guy? That guy is not who you probably think that guy is. But they don't know any of that. They just know that Reconstructionism, theonomy, and postmillennialism are things held to by people who stood strong that they respect, right? So they start these churches with those being things that they say they value. Usually it's a couple guys that listen to lots of podcasts. They start with those things, but they don't understand the Ordo Salutis. They don't understand the important, like how most Reformed systematics are built around the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments. And there, a lot of times, it's really weird. They'll have these very nuanced views of God's law, but not really understand like what you would see in the exposition of the Ten Commandments and the larger catechism because they haven't done their work. Those churches then are built around these boutique doctrines that use really high terminology and language. So it's a high barrier to entry. So it's hard for people to hop in. You can think of it this way. That happened that happened in Calvary Chapel too. But it wasn't with those doctrines. It was with like, why are we in Indiana wearing Hawaiian shirts? Well, it's because Chuck Smith, when he wasn't preaching, wore Hawaiian shirts. Now, Chuck on Sundays wore a suit. Every time I went to Costa Mesa, he was wearing a suit. But Chuck would wear Hawaiian shirts. And then they would always talk about the hippie revival. Dude, in the 90s, who cared about the hippie revival? I was listening to Nirvana and Pearl Jam. It was grunge all out. And we're talking about Keith Green and all these Malcolm and Alwyn, all these hippie singers, and listen to Maranatha music, which, sounds like something you're going to listen to when you're having a cavity dealt with. And so you'd come into these Indiana churches with this weird music with Hawaiian t-shirt wearing pastors. And the pastors would always say things like, well, don't you know? And that's because Chuck Smith, I don't know why he did it, but he had this kind of slow verbal tick where he would say, don't you know? And so you got all these guys. So you walk into that church and you're like, I don't understand any of this.
Right.
Right. And that happens in Reformed churches too, except without a pastor. And so then you got who's going to come to a small church like that with all that? Well, either an older dude who has nowhere else to go for whatever reason, or a younger guy who needs a starting opportunity. And those church plants are ones that I see fail. The best church plants have a church planting team that includes a lead guy that's going to be doing most of the preaching, a guy that's good at articulation of vision, and then some older guys or like-minded guys that maybe they don't have those exact same gifts, but while they love that pastor, they're not fanboy sycophants. They're people that hold them accountable. Building that church planting team is what I think is key. Those other ways work sometimes, but it's like in spite of the model, right? The model itself is a dangerous model. That's kind of a rant.
Yeah.
There you go.
No, it's fine. So with the franchise model, and this gets us to kind of what I wanted to talk about with manhood, because we were able to see this really early on, and we got great training on team from Fellowship Associates, where they were just really de-emphasizing the centrality of the personality and all that kind of stuff, like planting with maturity. And we could go off in doctrinal development and what you talked about with ecclesiology and all that kind of stuff, because I think that's a really interesting topic with, especially if you study systematic theologies, which I used to love, and now I appreciate them for what they are. But the order in which you put those doctrines matters, and it shows a lot about your system and where you're going to put emphases. With the franchise model, I think a lot of men are drawn to it because what I would see and what a lot of people see, it's like you'd see these guys get up and plant an Acts 29 church, and they would imitate Driscoll's mannerisms, right? So they'd be yelling, but it's like, dude, that's not you. Like, that's not, it sounds cringy. Like you've got a nasally voice but however, it's not even pushback, but here's where I want to dovetail into masculinity is men are naturally people who want to imitate older men. Like by God's design, we are imitators. We want to follow somebody, we want to be led and mentored, we want to do that kind of stuff. So the critique is totally valid. How do we um, kind of tap into the nature of men to naturally want to do that, and not squish it to the point where we're just kind of NPCs on the confessions, where we're just kind of like, well, I have no personality and
Yeah.
I don't imitate anyone, or we overemphasize the individuality of each pastor to the point where, like, well, that's just who I am. It's super authentic. How would you speak to that matter, especially as it pertains to men today?
Well, what's key is they're imitating a finished product, right? So you've got this pastor who's got all this experience and all this history, and you're trying to imitate that. So I think take the intergenerational divide that's intense right now. S- Some of the boomers that I know, and this is true of me as well. I were broke a long, long time, and they finally got that power, that money later in life. And so they're like, "Oh, look at what that older generation has and that we don't have." Hey, when they were your age, they didn't have anything either, man. Right? And now they do, and you want what they have right now, but you have to put in the time. And what you have to understand is that there's a substance to ministry. So, what's the substance of the best of Driscoll? The best of Driscoll is that he was bold, he wasn't scared, he was able to speak and reach a lot of people. He understood the times, right? He was really good. He's a master at really seeing the trends coming. But now it looks kind of sad. Like you hear him trying to jump on Christian nationalism and Israel and Hamas and all that sort of stuff, and it's kind of taken a dispy sort of feel to it.
Yeah.
But but knowing the times you live in and how to speak to people is important. So, or you take a guy like Doug Wilson. A guy like Doug Wilson, it's his ability to interact with lots of ideas in a very clear way. He's witty, he's happy, he's joyful. He's willing to interact again with a kind of a broad scheme of things. He's very Catholic in a little C sense. I find Doug has an ability. Him and Chris Wiley and George Grant are these guys that have an ability to just be friends with lots of folks, even when those people criticize them. So I think what they're doing is they're mimicking a final product as opposed to saying, what is the substance of this guy that I like so much? Right. And so that's what I would say. Like, you don't you like, I'm like my father in some ways and my mother in some ways, but I'm very much my own person, and that kind of developed out over time. So have people that you look up to, people you emulate. I mean, I've been deeply affected by like Martin Lloyd Jones, by Chuck Smith, of course, by Driscoll to a degree. I was already kind of older, so I think that my what I would say is that my critique isn't being influenced by people, but mimicking them. And you maybe start with a mimic, but you find your own voice. Like I've preached a whole lot. I have my own style. In my associate pastor, he has not preached as much, but I'm listening to him every week. Kind of like you learn as a pastor to, when you say something really good, to pause and just let it sit a bit, right? Give that little space. You learn how to talk. Like if my associate pastor tried to teach like me, it'd be so weird. Matter of fact, the blessing of my associate pastor is how different he is from me, and that we each have our own voice. So I think you look at what is appealing to those ministries at a substantial level, and then ask, how would that translate to where God has put me, right? And start to work at that. And there's always a sort of fake it till you make it period. That's a little awkward. But you'll move past that. That's different than wholesale grabbing something and moving it over, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's I think it's motivated by kind of a laziness, a lack of vision, probably a lack of gifting. Because people that are gifted communicators and leaders, they're always going to put their own spin on something anyway. That's just who they are, right?
Hmm.
But a lot of folks that don't have those gifts, just like, hey man, paint by numbers, tell me what to do. And I think there's a lot of risk adverse, like, hey, that worked there, it'll work here. Moscow is a very particular culture. I lived in Bloomington, Indiana. That's a very particular culture. When you have a small town that's dominated by a liberal college presence, it changes things. So I don't know if that helps at all, but those are some of the thoughts that came to my mind.
That's great. So with Men particularly, though. You wrote a book, It's Good to Be a Man. Great book. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. You're starting a podcast. This is Foster. Um, It's Good to Be a Man. Really, it seemed to blow up. Like it seemed like it was really effective. A lot of guys were reading it. I mean, I latched. I think I like. I think you know this. Like we have a store. Kim owns a store, so we have a business on the side. I don't call myself bivocational because I don't take any money from the business or anything like that. But I have this vision of starting like a men's store,
Cool.
and I saw your. I must have seen it because I was like, dude, we're gonna put a sign that says "It's good to be a man" in the store. Just like when you walk in, it's immediately masculine. It's gonna be Waylon Jennings playing. There's gonna be brands that
Nice.
guys love. There's gonna be whiskey, that kind of stuff. It's maybe it can happen one day. I'd love to see it happen, but it just that phrase "It's good to be a man" was so compelling to me. And before I had even read the book, and I think there's a lot of interest today for a lot of dudes, whether they're listening to kind of the secular voices or they're listening to pastors. And I've seen you speak at different conferences, men's stuff. There's a whole industry out there that you're really familiar with, and the manosphere, whatever you want to call it. Why was It's Good to Be a Man? Why do you think it resonated so well with so many people?
I think it was very sincere that we were. So non-tenant was my co-author. He was kind of someone that came to the manosphere trying to work out some of his own issues. And I came to the manosphere trying to help some of my friends. A lot of people came to the manosphere, which is just a collection of podcasts, blogs, websites that produce men's content that is aware and against feminism. It's how it kind of distinguishes itself from just pro masculinity content, right? It's pro masculinity in the face of misandry, in the face of feminism. And I came to it because I had all these young guys that were struggling to get married and I didn't understand it. And then they were telling me how they're listening to pickup artists. And I'm like, pickup artists? Like, what is a pickup artist? I think I know what that means. And then I was like, that's crazy. So I started to interact with all that stuff. And it was still like, it was not mainstream at all. And like Jordan Peterson was, he was kind of like maybe the gateway drug to that sort of stuff. But I started reading on that, and then I found out that my friend non-tenant was also reading that stuff, and I was like, okay, cool. Well, I want to do create a systematic theology or something for men. So we started to talk about it, and we started this podcast. And I think why it resonated is we caught the wave just as it was starting to raise. So a lot of people got on it as it was cresting. And I think it has crested, and there's another iteration on its way right now. But also we weren't trying to market. They're just trying to interact with those ideas, and it took off. Like I'm not, I know how to market, but I'm just a grumpy person when it comes to anything that's celebrity.
Yeah,
I kind of hate celebrity. I hate monetization. And I don't like my audience telling me what to do.
right.
I'm like, dude, I don't care if you stop listening. My life will literally be the same if you do. Like it doesn't hurt my feelings, right? I'm here because I care about the topic. I'm not here because I care about your eyeballs,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And
Yeah,
so I can get a little feisty sometimes, but I think it just really captured people. And we also didn't hate men. The other thing that ended up being the biggest deal is that on my lunch break, I put it out on Twitter. Anyone that wants to talk for an hour, I'm available, any man. So I talked to hundreds of men about their problems, like guys that have erectile dysfunction. I had one guy that lost his penis in a car wreck. I
oh
was
my
like,
gosh.
he's like, how do I live a normal life? I'm like, you don't, right? You don't, right? This is why the resurrection. I had guys who wife was cheating on him and he knew, but she didn't know he knew. I had guys that had gone through divorce, guys that had admitted that they beat their wife up and the church had sided against them and they feel terrible. And like it was all these crazy stories. Like
Yeah,
I was just dropped into they were so hungry for someone that just would listen and care. And I
yeah,
often didn't have like genius counsel. A lot of times it's like, man, that's really rough. Here's a couple things to think about. Let me pray with you.
yeah.
Some of those guys, this is crazy. This is a true story. To give you an example of this is how blessed of a life I live. Like I live an insane life. I was walking. So this guy emails me and him and his wife's not getting along. They're going to a marriage counseling. It's not going well. And so he's writing these long emails. We're writing back and forth. I'd never met this guy. We weren't in a group or anything together. He just emailed me off the website. And I remember I said, have you told your wife that you love her? like just look her in the eyes and say, look, I don't regret marrying you. You're the only person I ever want to marry. I love you. I want us to grow together. I'm glad we had kids because kids is more of you in the world, more of us. Like, have you ever just taken the time to do that? And he's like, I don't think I have in a long time. I said, why don't you try that? And then I made some I really encouraged them to get out of marriage counseling. Marriage counseling often destroys marriages. So anyway, he says it got better, and I don't hear anything from him forever. Like, I mean, like 2 years. I'm walking through either Miami or Orlando airport, and I have got a glass of wine. It was Miami. I got a glass of wine, and I'm sitting at this table. And this guy walks up to me, and he says, "Hey, you don't know me. You're Michael Foster." And I said, "That is my name." and he was that guy. And he said, look, I passed you. I saw you. I recognize you. And my wife's down there at the gate. We're getting ready to board the plane. But I want you to know that I think it was their 30th anniversary. We're out here in Miami for our 30th anniversary. We're married. We're still married. We're happy. God has been so good. Thank you so much. And I think I wrote a couple emails, man. I wrote a couple emails, and this guy is crediting me in part with his marriage still. And I run into him at the Miami airport. What a blessing! And I think what's good to be a man is that we had compassion on men. We didn't hate
Yeah.
them, and we thought their problems were real, and we tried to write to it, and we tried to put our finger on who's persecuting them, which really was either feminists or these white knight pastors. And people hate that I talk about white knight pastors, and the people I hate it most are white knight pastors. That's why.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a real issue. So we wrote the book to appeal to, we said right away that this is not going to be a timeless book, but we want it to be timely. And we want to speak to men where they're at. And we wanted to help those guys to understand how manhood was lost. These are the first 7 chapters, how it's regained through the gospel, and get them moving towards something positive. Right. And it just took off. And it was really such a wonderful privilege to be part of that movement. I hear my ideas all the time. People took them and are building on them and expanding them. There should be no greater joy for an author and a teacher than to hear their ideas popularized. I don't care who gives me credit. I'm
Right.
just like, I'm so happy to hear people talk about androgyny and effeminacy and white knights. And I'm glad I got to play a role in burning down egalitarianism to the ground, which is absolutely what I'm trying to do, because it's wicked and evil and destroys lives.
That's excellent, man. That's great stuff. Yeah, I got into Jordan Peterson whenever his 12 Rules for Life came out, and like it really just spoke to a lot of things. And then I got onto Aaron Renn after 2020, and then I started paying attention to what you're writing, and then I just started noticing things publicly, and I started teaching those things. I started in my home where I started repenting,
Amen.
to the Lord and to my wife about ways that I misperceived my own role and that kind of thing. And so it's been really fun to watch, and I'm seeing a lot of fruit in our own ministry as we teach on these matters just more clearly, not dumbed down, not
Amen.
trying to be afraid, not trying to appease. And so it's a real blessing. Now, yeah, I think the timeliness also dovetails into This Is Foster.
Yeah.
You're starting this new podcast. The first episode speaks exactly to an issue that I'm very passionate about, because it's kind of speaks to the pietistic impulse in evangelicalism to strip men, particularly, of any kind of desire, ambition, a want out of life. And this is something that if you listen to my podcast, this comes up over and over again, mainly because it's part of my story where
Yeah.
I was that kind of guy. I was like, I wasn't clear on my mission. I wasn't clear. And that's where Driscoll nailed it, on certain matters where it's like a guy's like a pickup truck. He's got to have a load in the back of the truck. And that analogy really tracks with a lot of dudes. But why do you think in evangelicalism in America, particularly, there's such a emphasis on squashing desire? You'll get guys up on stage that are obviously attractive and successful, and they lecture a bunch of pastors and say, "How dare you have ambition? How dare you pursue power?"
Yeah.
And I just think it's so stupid, because it's like, dude, you're the guy that did it, and now you're trying to. I don't know if it's a power move or what, but like, why do you think it's so easy to do? Why do you think it's so popular in American evangelicalism to squash men's desires?
Well, it keeps men pacified, so it's easier to manage pacified men. That could be kind of one reason. Sometimes they call that guy that stands up and insults everyone the AMOG, the alpha male of the group. So Driscoll would AMOG quite a bit. He was weird because it really Driscoll's kind of has a lot of boomer to him, but he also has that edgy Gen X. He's just like caught between worlds. And his reverse engineering your life thing he did is like super helpful. And that's a lot of my mission ideas definitely played off that. So I think he was good. I think it's guys that weren't brought into the world of men by a father tend to be really competitive and they need to prove themselves. And you see that online all the time. Like I posted a clip where I don't feel like I have to argue with people. People always want to like debate me, like that change my mind meme. They'll say
Yeah.
something, 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 change my mind. I always read that I'm a needy person, give me attention. That's me. I'm like, I don't want to change your mind. I don't care. Well, don't you think you should care? Like, I can only tell you how I feel, and I don't care. But I think a lot of guys really are out there trying to prove that they're this awesome guy, and you saw a lot of that in Driscoll. I think, like, I'm the best dude or whatever, as opposed to being a man who is comfortable in himself and wants to lift other people up, right? And that's a fatherly attitude, but it's hard to know how to be fatherly when you haven't been fathered, and I see it as that. The other thing is there is just a short bus tendency, like the stupidity in our world right now, the lack of reading comprehension, the inability to think is mind blowing. Okay, religion is neutral. If it is false religion, it is bad. If it is true religion, it is good. It's easy. Ambition. If it is God centered for the glory of God, it is good. If it is self centered, it is bad. Right? It's crazy how simple this conversation is. And, but I think people will think like you shouldn't desire to be great. So, okay, I would like to be greater in my faithfulness to the Lord as a provider or as a discipler of my children. Well, no, that's okay. All right, all right. I would like to be better at my job, right? I'd like to grow as a manager or a director or as a better tradesman, craftsman. Well, that's okay too. Then what are you talking about? Why are we
Right.
having this? Like, this is like Sesame Street level stuff, guys. This is not difficult. Like, it is good to have godly ambition. And we know that because it is a good aspiration to want to be an elder.
Right.
So we know it's good to have those. Selfish ambition, which we have a great definition of that in the worldly wisdom in James 2 or whatever it is. And so I think there's just people don't trust their desires. They don't have a doctrine of desires, and that's where guys like Augustine got it right. We're talking about
Yeah.
rightly ordered desires. So ambition, you're going to have ambition towards something. It's gonna You're gonna have it somewhere. It's natural. It's just got to be rightly ordered. And guys want to do great things. They want to serve God. Guys don't come to church because church is all about like give us your money, or invite your friends. It's all about building up something else. When you make church about, first off, worshiping God, so number one, that's the purpose of Sunday service, the public adoration of the Holy Trinity. Second, it's also about equipping the saints to be salt and light in the world. So our church doesn't have lots of programs because my focus is on to help you go be the best lawyer, to help you go be the best doctor, to help you be a wonderful household executive, which is what I call housewives. Go get that stuff done. So we are there to equip you, and I want you to have tons of influence, and I want you to be the best at what you do. If it's a janitor or whatever, I want you to seek excellence and know that whatever you offer to God, uh, when it's offered in faith, it's wonderful. Even though I think about how the best singer on earth is gonna be dim compared to the worst singer in heaven, right? And so that attracts men to the church, where it's like it's okay to want to be great. Go do something. And I
Yeah.
with this is Foster. The goal was it's good to be a man. Uh, was a little high, more principles and theology. The practical side was always me pushing it back. Like Nan's always pushing it towards the more abstract because that's how he's wired. and I'm always like things, I'm kind of a principled pragmatist. But this, I realized that in the same way people are going to the red pill for kind of how to interact with women and think about that, a lot of men are going to all these kind of self-help stuff that isn't Christian. All these books on time management, delegation, self-development. I think we should be speaking to that stuff as Christians. So This is Foster is heavily focused on the practical side of that. I do a episode that's a teaching episode that's like 10 to 12 minutes. Like I got an episode coming out on Monday that is on a doctrine of sleep, right? How it's important to have a good sleep habit. And then I have an interview with someone that's a non-pastor usually that's out there. So David Bonson is a guy that's not a pastor. He's out there doing wealth management. I've got Matt Reynolds, who's on his way to becoming a pastor, but not there yet. He does physical training and all that. Then I've got Camden Spiller, who's the CEO of a company I work for. I've got guys wrestling. I've got the national head of the National Wrestling Coach Association coming on. So I'm trying to bring in those sort of guys that can speak to these issues. And then I just have a Q&A episode. And the goal is to kind of feed this stuff to men, and also talk about stuff in such a way that you can involve your 12-year-old son if you want to. So not overly, we're not going to be saying words like whore all the time. That's
Right.
not going to happen.
Yeah.
Like, because that, while that is a biblical word, it's not like in every verse of the Bible. And I don't necessarily want my 12-year-old running around and say, you know what the problem with the world today is? What is the problem? It's all the whores. Like, well, that is a problem, son. Maybe let's not lead with that though. So
Yeah, that's I had to stop listening to the briefing in the car by Al Mohler because every episode is about the sexual revolution. And like it's important. Like no one's saying it's not important, but I've got a 10-year-old and 8-year-old boy in the car. It's like, yeah, like this isn't the only thing. There's practical things. So really appreciate the work you're doing. I'll make sure to put a link to the show notes to the podcast. It's on Apple and Spotify, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. And if there's anywhere else people want to follow you, keep up with your work, obviously they're not going to be able to debate you online, but is there anywhere, a website or anything they should go to keep up with the work you're doing?
Yeah, you can go to thisisfoster.com, but also I'm just really active mostly on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. And my tag there is This Is Foster. And I do try to respond to emails, but debating with people on Twitter is really silly in my mind. So
agreed. Yeah.
And there's other people to do it. I can make recommendations if you want someone to fight with.
There's lots of people who are eager for it.
I'll send them Matt's user. This is Matt Patrick.
Matt Pat 1.
Yeah.
Matt Pat 1.
Ask him about his gay shirts. So she's like, I don't know if this is going to be video, but this is my Matt Patrick. That's my Matt Patrick impression right there.
Brutal Foster.
Yeah. We see you have chest hair, Matt. Interesting. You must be a man.
Well, dude, this was a great time. I could talk for hours about all these different topics. Maybe we'll have to do it again. Yeah. But thanks so much for spending some of your morning with me. And I hope this listener, I hope this blessed you. So, Michael, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Foolproof Theology. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you go give me a great rating on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you're listening. Subscribe. Keep getting episodes delivered to you. I keep trying to bring great guests that are speaking to really important issues in life and church and culture. And so do that. Also go sign up on the Patreon. On the Patreon, you can ask me any questions you want. You can get early episode releases. You can also get merch for the podcast. Go sign up there at $5 a month. And it'll be a great way to both participate and share the podcast, but also support the podcast and help me keep bringing great content to you. We'll see you next time.